In this presentation, we'll walk through the basics of business models for cleaner cooking solutions in Africa. And this is part of a wider series of online learning presentations delivered by the CESA project, which is funded by the EU. The content of these slides was prepared by myself, James Hazlip, and Elizabeth Bieber from Siemens Stiftung. So we'll jump right in here to explore a few of the key terms, and in the subsequent slides we'll draw on experience from across Africa, so basically a mix of theory and practice. In general, we'll also try to explore some of the advantages and disadvantages of different business models, and focusing on that key term. A business model is basically a plan or a strategy that a company uses to generate revenue and to make a profit. So it describes how the company will basically create and deliver value in its operations. A business model typically includes information about the company's target customers, its products or services, its marketing and distribution channels, pricing strategy, and its cost structure. And the ultimate goal of a business model is to create a sustainable and profitable business by identifying the best way to deliver value to its customers while minimizing costs and maximizing revenue. And revenue can be defined as the amount of money that a customer has agreed to pay for a specific product or service. And when we're talking about customers, it's very important as a potential business developer to first identify your customers, breaking them into the segments to understand who it is you're targeting, how and why they buy a specific product or service. This table, building on that, this table basically breaks down the market segments for clean cooking, where on the left-hand side, we divide the product into three types: the fuel, the stove, and the cooking system, or the tool and fuel. And the cooking system is basically a mix of the stove and the fuel that is used to cook food. And dividing the energy service into fuel and the stove corresponds to the upfront or capital costs of the stove versus the ongoing or operational costs of purchasing the fuel. And generally speaking, the higher the capital cost, the stove, the lower the fuel costs, assuming that a more expensive stove is more fuel efficient, which isn't always the case. But as a general rule of thumb, I think that's a useful way to approach this. And importantly, since both the fuel costs can be high and ongoing, especially in urban areas, it's overcoming the capital cost of a superior stove that is really key to delivering the financial savings and the co-benefits to households of cleaner cooking systems. And this is why a lot of clean cooking business models focus on ways to overcome the capital barriers to purchasing the new system. And this is a particular challenge across Africa, where the cost of credit is generally far higher than it is in richer countries, especially for households. And the column on customer segments here gives an insight into the starting point and behaviors for the customers who either want to upgrade their fuel or their stove and how this translates into revenues, which of course is linked to consumers' ability and willingness to pay. So before we dive into a summary of the main business models, I think it's useful to revisit some of the main barriers to upgrading clean cooking technologies in Africa, broadly speaking. And as mentioned in the last slide, affordability remains the main barrier. And this is both a reality, but also a perception problem, where consumers do not always have access to market intel on the options and prices for alternative technologies. And likewise, concerns about the hardware. Will it suit my cooking needs? Is it worth paying for a new stove or cooking system? These are mostly issues of awareness and access to market information. So, and linked to that, a final barrier, which is often cited, can be called cultural or habitual. In other words, people tend to stick to what they know. And I think this is especially true when it comes to something as fundamental and everyday as cooking and eating, which is tied to family dynamics and routines, etc. So given all this, and there's a lot of research, for example, by the MEX, the Modern Energy Cooking Services Project, shows the power of demonstration effects and of organizing show and tell sessions for new cooking technologies. And in East Africa, for example, celebrity chefs have been used and credited with popularizing the use of electric pressure cookers for the urban middle class segment. And I think this is something that business developers can incorporate into their business model, essentially creating or expanding demand for their particular product or service. And now to the main business models. And as mentioned, business models essentially exist in many cases for cleaner cooking systems. They exist to overcome the upfront capital barriers to purchasing the technology. And here we'll discuss three main means of doing so. First is the pay-as-you-go model. Second is microfinance, or the provision of in-house financing by the companies selling cleaner cooking systems, fuels, or stoves. And then public-private partnerships, which are essentially a mix of subsidies or donor-distributed technologies. And I'll briefly explain each of these models, their basic advantages, disadvantages, and provide some real-world examples from the clean cooking market in Africa. There are also leasing models for industrial use or by large institutions, but here we'll only focus on the household level. So pay-as-you-go. This allows customers to own clean cooking systems without incurring significant upfront costs. The payments are usually made in installments or priced into the fuel. The pay-as-you-go business models operate effectively as a service where the household has the equipment installed by the operator or the seller, and its use is monitored by data flows either from direct metering or from a minimum fuel purchase agreement. Now, the revenues can be used on the plus side. The revenues can be used to maintain the system if where needed, for example, if a stove breaks, and that avoids additional expenditure by households, by users. It can also build on existing mobile money technologies and networks, which replaces the need to go physically to an agent or bank to make the payments. But it's important to remember that pay-as-you-go only spreads the payments. It doesn't necessarily reduce the overall capital cost of the cooking system. But there is potential to leverage results-based financing or even carbon credits to offset some of the capital costs of clean cooking technologies if the non-financial benefits of the technology can be measured and verified. And again, that's something that pay-as-you-go can help because of the data flows on use. And for example, the World Bank's Clean Cooking Fund is already using results-based financing and incorporating the monetary value of the environmental, health, and gender equity benefits, co-benefits, and converting these into cost savings, which are then passed on to the consumer. Now, on microfinance and in-house financing, this is a more traditional business model or means to overcome the market barriers to clean cooking, especially for low-income households. Some examples of asset finance for clean cooking include the Grameen Shakti, which uses the Grameen Bank's network to finance energy products for its clients. In Africa, M-Copper uses the M-Pesa platform to agree installment payments for its products. And in-house financing, the provision of loans by the companies selling the technologies, is also practiced but comes with its own challenges, especially as they have to develop in-house credit teams, processes, and systems and how to manage those risks. So it's not always straightforward. Now, the third main model that we'll discuss here is the, you could say, public-private partnerships, a mix of subsidies and donor-funded models. And this is basically where a state agency or an NGO partners with a private company to provide clean cooking solutions at lower than market prices or for free. I mean, typically, the state would provide an incentive or tax break or subsidy where the private companies provide the clean cooking solutions. And this encourages the private sector to invest in the technologies and the solutions, but also runs the risk of picking winners, which can also be financially unsustainable. So this model is mostly used in emergency situations like refugee camps or in rural areas at the bottom of the pyramid to kickstart demand. And I think it's most effective when the subsidies are specific and time-bound, with the aim of triggering a positive feedback loop. For example, from all the time savings that households get from avoided wood fuel collection that can then be converted into income-generating opportunities. A couple of examples here. Both from Africa. The Safi stoves were subsidized in Kenya and then offered through a revolving fund for households in the Kibera slum of Nairobi. And a company called Gaia supplied bioethanol from sugarcane production for cooking systems for refugees in Ethiopia. And some of these have been quite successful in terms of uptake and use, but have faced challenges in terms of financial sustainability and scale up. Now we'll focus a little bit on the business model canvas. And this is a well-known template for developing a business model. Basically, if you can answer all of the questions in these boxes and provide data or evidence to support your claims or support the answers, then you have a viable business model, at least on paper. And perhaps it's most important to start with identifying your customer segments. Who is it that you're targeting and why? And then if you look at the central column on value proposition, how do you create value for your customers? And from there, you can work outwards to answer questions about the social and environmental impacts, the channels through which customers access your products and service, and of course, how do you generate income? How do you create and deliver the products? And who are your key partners, etc. All of these are the basics, inputs to a business model. So it's a very useful way of structuring your thoughts on this. This, I think, is the final slide. And business models for clean cooking are evolving in ways that both shape and are shaped by changes in technology development. And it is a fast-changing market. And some key players are already expanding into other technologies and fuels to increase their customer base and enter new markets. For companies that started as manufacturers of clean cooking products such as Burn, the main motivation in their case for expanding into the electric pressure cooker market is to leverage existing resources such as their manufacturing infrastructure, distribution networks, and building on that established market presence. And I think overall, we're starting to see the beginnings of an electric cooking revolution in Africa, with even off-grid solar e-cooking technologies now reaching technical and economic feasibility. We're not there yet, but I think through a combination of the right state-driven enabling environment, including taxation and subsidies, and of course, business model development on the supply side, then African countries, or many African countries, will be able to transition to the widespread use of Tier 4 plus cooking systems, that is high quality cooking systems, by 2030. And in doing so, they can reach or even exceed their SDG 7 targets on access to clean cooking. So that's a positive conclusion here. And this was a very condensed run through of basic information on clean cooking business models. I hope it was clear. And we've also prepared a document with further reading and resources with information on donor financing and support to clean cooking businesses. And finally, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Elizabeth. And thank you very much for listening.